Hi, thank you for tuning in to this pre-recorded webinar for the 2021 Children's Behavioral Health Conference. My name is Dr. Paul Shawler, and I'm the Chief Psychologist for the Office of Juvenile Affairs. OJA is the state agency that oversees juvenile justice services across the state. I'm also on faculty at OU Health and Pediatrics, where I work on the Center on Child Abuse and Neglect. I'm excited to be with you today to share with you the goal of eradicating the cradle to prison pipeline. Every day as Oklahomans, we have immense opportunities to positively impact the future of young children and families. As Oklahomans, we have some room to grow, but I cannot be more proud to be with you today to discuss how we can work together on finding tangible solutions to improve the lives of children and families. As mental health providers and advocates of children, we are the backbones of progress in our state, and together we can change the trajectories of lives to improve Oklahoma's overall health. Today in this presentation, I really have three broad goals to discuss. We're going to review a large range of topics on early childhood adverse experiences. We're going to review some alarming statistics on how our adult correction systems is put in place and how that impacts the young lives of children. And throughout this presentation, we're going to continue to hear a constant theme is that this cradle to prison pipeline is not set in stone. It is not fixed. And together we can work on tangible, common sense reforms. And if we implement it right, not only can we save enormous amounts of money, but we can also at the same time enhance community safety, improve well-being, and really see true outcomes of success for a whole host of children and families across the state. And so throughout this presentation, whether you work for a state agency, whether you're a private practitioner, whether you're a foster parent, teacher, a home visitor, or a mental health provider, I encourage you to come back to this question, that in Oklahoma, are we a part of the problem, or are we a part of coming up with the solutions? And so as we move forward and we talk about cases, regardless of whether you work with adults, whether you work with infants, or whether you work with teenagers, we each have a role and we each have a part of the apple that we can bite to really change the lives of young children and families. And so I want to start with a story, and I want to put this visual in your mind to kind of center ourselves around this kind of presentation, around this training, and really about the future. What do you take away from this that you can take back to your workplace in the next 12 months and say, I really want to carry out my job and have these goals met? And I think that this story will help us kind of center ourselves around what are the needs that children and families have across our state. And so this is Jeremiah. Jeremiah is a little guy. He's only a couple months old. He was born in Del City, Oklahoma, and he doesn't know it yet, but he's already in the pipeline to prison before even taking a single step or uttering a single word. His mother, Brandy, is only 20, and Jeremiah is Brandy's second child. Brandy is living with a friend. She was evicted from her apartment when her boyfriend went to prison on a domestic violence charge. This all occurred while she was pregnant with Jeremiah. Brandy doesn't have childcare or a car, so although she really wants to work, she doesn't know where to start. If she were to work, she would have to leave her two kids at home with her friend's boyfriend. Brandy wants to finish high school, but because she moved out of her home at 16, she struggled. She wasn't getting along with her family and didn't have supports to help her. She described ongoing fights with her mother, who called the police to take her to detention after they engaged in a physical altercation where her mother pushed her first. Nothing happened to her mom. Brandy's boyfriend is getting ready to get out of prison, and she's worried that he won't stay away so she can make better choices for Jeremiah and her other child. At 2 months old, Jeremiah should have all the possible futures open to him across Oklahoma. But in reality, this infant boy is already not in the trajectory that leads to college, work, or healthy family success. He's at the very beginning of his pathway. And it's up to us to determine, is this going to be a pathway to prison, or is this a pathway where we can come in and support Jeremiah and his family? Again, it is up to us today to think about how our systems work together to come up and support young children and families so that they can have better outcomes. Again, it's the prison pipeline is not set in stone, and we can change it, and we must come together. And so I want to share some statistics. And again, just kind of imagine that picture of Jeremiah and keep that image in your head throughout this presentation, because there's some alarming statistics that go along with it. And in the events of our society today, it's no better time than to talk about the impacts of race and justice. And so the lifetime likelihood of a young Black male ending up in prison at some point in their lives is 1 in 3. Let that sink in for a minute. 1 in 3. You are almost guaranteed to live next to be a part of a family, to have someone in your family end up in prison if you're identified as African American. 1 in 6 Latino males end up in prison at some point in their life. 1 in 17 African American females at some point in their lifetimes end up in prison. And why is this important? And why are we talking about it? And how does this impact us every day in Oklahoma? Justice systems across the world operate differently, and it's how we respond to illegal behavior that oftentimes makes the biggest difference in the outcomes of young children. Oklahoma, unfortunately, just a handful of years ago, was ranked #1 in the world for incarcerating adults, both males and females. These numbers have improved in recent years, but not to the extent that would bring us down to the average when it comes to the US. And so as we talk about families that we work with, and we talk about youth that are at risk of system involvement, whether it be child welfare or juvenile justice, I want you to think about how all our policies and practices when it comes to how we manage adult crime directly impacts the lives and the future of young children whose parents end up in prison. And so all of our systems, both private and public, must come together to create solutions. And I'm excited that I think there's been no greater time in our history that we are actively working as one when it comes to identifying mental health and behavioral health is just as important as the physical health of those in our community. I'm excited for the State Department of Education really taking a leading role in embedding mental health professionals across the state, working with our Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, working with child welfare, working with OJA. Again, we have a number of private sector community-based mental health centers that are just doing some phenomenal work. And together, we will make the strides needed to improve our state. And so I like to start this presentation before we start talking more specifically about juvenile justice. And so I really like this quote that we are guilty of many errors and many faults, but our worst crime is abandoning the children, neglecting the fountain of life. Many of the things that we need can wait. The child cannot wait. Right now is the time that his bones are being formed, that his blood is being made, and that his senses are being developed. To him, we cannot answer tomorrow. His name is today. And so, again, keeping that image of Jeremiah in your head, thinking about today is the day that we need to do something different, because there is enormous promise in the outlook of children and youth if we get them the right services at the right time. And so I'm going to shift and talk about juvenile justice and some of the trends that we are seeing and how it impacts children and families in Oklahoma. And so many of you know this, but for those that don't, the history of juvenile justice really started in 1899 in Chicago. And it talked about young people needing a different system than how we treat adults who engage in illegal behavior. We need a system that understands that that the period of adolescence is rapidly evolving. It's changing dramatically, and that youth are continuing to grow and mature. And so in the 1990s, there was a huge surge in juvenile justice involvement. And they started to label adolescents as these super predators. And I'm excited to report that since the 1990s, we are at an all-time low in juvenile justice involvement in adolescents. We have not seen any major upward trends in violent or aggressive crime across the United States, and continue to see fewer and fewer kids penetrate the levels of juvenile justice. But at the same time, we continue to have this discussion of, well, how do we respond when kids engage in illegal behavior? Kids need accountability. We need community safety. But at the same time, we must develop systems and supports that help young children grow into healthy adults. And so there's a term that I like to bring up, again, talking about our society and racial justice. And that term has to do with adultification and how we see racial and ethnic disparities across our system. And so whenever I look at this slide, I ask myself, when does a kid grow up? When does a kid become capable of the acts that they engage in? What is our response, and how do we view young people, in particular young people of color? Do we view them as an adolescent who's made some pretty horrific decisions, or as a kid who has made poor choices but has so much potential to grow and learn if given the right set of experiences? And so whenever we work with youth and whenever we think about our system as mental health providers, many times people will say, well, I don't work with criminals. And I would say, but you do work with kids, right? And so how we label, how we identify young people, how we as mental health providers or advocates in our schools, how we respond to kids when they engage in behavior that's not appropriate makes a world of difference. And so I hope that we can all think about, how do we welcome opportunities to work with youth that have made poor choices so we can help them get back on track. And so I've said this once, but I think it's worth bearing repeating, is that adolescents are not small adults. Adolescents are continuing to grow, learn, and be influenced, that they are not fixed. And I'm going to share some great statistics, even talking about kids at the highest level of our juvenile justice system. Even though they've done something serious or violent, their lifelong trajectories for ongoing serious or violent offending is likely low. And so, again, we need to respond. We need to hold youth accountable, but at the same time, we need to wrap them with supports to set them up for success for the future, because they will be in the community. They will be your next door neighbor. They will have kids that will be friends with your kids in school. And so we need to come up with solutions that work. And so whenever I do these presentations and I talk to mental health providers, I always default to our ethics codes of do no harm. And I was speaking recently to the District Attorney's Council, and I brought up the fact that, my ethics say I can do no harm. And they said, well, we prosecute cases. We inherently cause harm. And I kind of stood back for a second and I said, again, juvenile justice was founded, again, just a little over 100 years ago, with the whole purpose to be rehabilitative. And so it wasn't designed as a punitive-based system or a punishment-based system. And so if we are coming up and we are having court processes that automatically lead to worse outcomes, why are we doing it that way? How can we help people take a lens where, yes, we need to hold youth accountable, but in order to get youth to make better decisions, we have to put them in the right environment in order to do so. We have to influence how they are responded to at school, how they communicate with their family. What is the likelihood that they're going to complete high school and obtain career skills as they grow up? And so at the end of the day, what outcome do we want to see? How can we work together where, again, we are responding appropriately when illegal behavior happens, but we're not causing harm either to the young child or our communities? And so teenagers is a tough group of kids to work with, whether they're system involved or they're your teenagers at home. We all have gone through this pivotal period where we've made some poor decisions, where we get stuck in our head. And sometimes you don't even know what they're thinking. Sometimes, again, when we were teens, we may have done things that, looking back, we're surprised that we're alive. And so uh, I bring this up to talk about sometimes teens make horrible decisions, and sometimes they get caught up in the situation that goes terribly wrong. But that doesn't have to end their trajectory for success. In fact, that may be the first time that they start to identify that they need to work with others to be successful in life. And it's a big wake up call whenever a youth is system involved. And so, again, juvenile justice practices across the country look like this graph, where numbers have fallen 50% over the last 2 decades. And so something is working, whether it's because kids are staying at home and they're not out running the streets, or whether there's more Ring doorbells. Something is working where we are seeing less and less kids, fewer and fewer kids being arrested and being adjudicated for offenses across the United States. And so as these numbers continue to decline, youth that rise up to the level of juvenile justice tend to have more and more mental health problems and behavioral challenges that we'll talk about kind of moving forward. And so when we talk about what is the role of mental health, I want to paint a picture of another trend that's occurring across the country, and that is that youth that have engaged in illegal behavior, almost across the board, what we're finding in study after study out of thousands and thousands of youth is that if we keep kids in the community, if we keep them in their family set, if we keep them in school, those kids that are not removed, that are treated at home, have better outcomes and are much less likely to engage in future offending in the future. And so I want you to think about that, because change is hard, and how we respond to change is something that plagues systems, plagues communities, because people are used to it one way. And so we're in this rapid shift of really trying to understand, how do we best serve kids and how do we reduce crime in our communities? And COVID has made us change rapidly overnight. And so the Annie E. Casey Foundation ran a really neat study looking at youths who were detained in detention, so pre-adjudicatory cases. And what they found is that detention rates plummeted by 52% in March and April at the very beginning of COVID. This change was equal to that took place over 13 years of really looking at when and why do we use juvenile detention. And so I could go on for about an hour talking about why is detention something that we don't want to utilize if we don't have to. And the simple answer is it's because kids that go to detention are more likely to be adjudicated. And those kids who are adjudicated are more likely to come back into our system if they have had stays in detention. And so without going off on a full tangent over this pre-recorded webinar, I'm going to stay on track and talk about who are these kids that our system comes into contact with. How do they get to us? And then as we start to know who are these kids, how do they get to us? That's where we really start to think about what types of services, what types of supports, and how does each individual have a role? Again, whether you're the school teacher, the foster parent, or a mental health provider. And so we ran some statistics a few years ago looking at the number of kids that enter juvenile justice contact that had previous contact with the Department of Human Services, or DHS. And what we found is that over a 4-year period, the number of kids that touched our system that had previously been involved at some level of DHS shot up all the way to 80%, meaning that most of the kids at some point in their life were known to the state, were known to DHS, and that those moments are potential moments where we must have missed something because they ended up in juvenile justice. What are these prevention windows that we should be capitalizing on? And this isn't a point your finger, this isn't a blame. This is a, how do we meet people on the front porch? How do we take these initiatives like Be a Neighbor across Oklahoma? We can see these families like Jeremiah. They're out there left and right every day. We interact with these families, who are in need of support and services. It is through no fault of their own, in many cases, no fault of their own, that we don't set them up for success. And so as we continue, again, think about what is your role? What are these windows of opportunity, and how can we fill these gaps in our state? And so as our kids, again, have touched DHS at some point, the vast majority, over 70% of kids that touch juvenile justice also have a mental health condition. 100% of kids that are removed from the home have some kind of mental health condition, as well as oftentimes co-occurring substance abuse and other types of concerns that we need to address. And so, again, there's no better place than to be at this Children's Behavioral Health Conference talking about juvenile justice youth, because these are the kids that need the most support almost out of all of our systems that we work in. And so recently my sister sent me over this photo, and it just got me thinking about, again, the lives of young children and how our daily interactions can make a world of difference. And unfortunately, what we know is that adverse childhood experiences are significant in Oklahoma. Again, we led the country in the number of worst outcomes for kids when it came to them experiencing ACEs. And so, believe it or not, kids that have more ACEs are more likely to end up in juvenile justice involvement. Again, we ran stats and we looked at how many of our kids in our system live with a single parent or one parent. And almost 70% of our kids lived in a single parent household. Again, thinking about how many of their kids only have one parent because the other one is incarcerated. Again, this is not to blame single parents or single family households on kids making poor decisions, because you can raise good children in a single parent household, and many of you perhaps grew up that way or came from that environment. It's possible to do it in heroic situations. It's much more difficult to do, and the numbers really move against young people in those settings because young people need supports. They need people to help monitor and supervise them. Some other alarming statistics came out that really looked at, how many kids live with both parents versus grandparents or relatives. And so we have more kids living with grandparents and relatives than we do with both parents. And so, again, thinking about incarceration, thinking about the state of emergency that the opioid crisis has created across the country, and in particular in hard-hit areas in Oklahoma. And so there are many factors to look at. Why do kids make poor decisions and engage in illegal behavior? I kind of put in here, excuse me. I put in here 4 broad categories around basic resources, development and skills, family and community, and general adolescence. General adolescence is a period of transition, where you grow up, the policing practices in the community, how many jobs are available, what schools kids go to. All of those things make a significant difference. And so, excuse me. So I want to take a step back and just talk about environments and development. And as mental health providers, we often talk about kind of systems theory. And when it comes to kids that have juvenile justice and child welfare involvement, systems theory really needs to drive our conversations, given how kids come to us. There was a popular book that came out called Outliers, and Malcolm Gladwell told a story. It was a true story about a town in Canada that, for whatever reason, kids born in September in this province in Canada were much more likely to go on and play professional hockey in the NHL. And so he talked about, why is it that kids born in September become professional athletes, but kids born in March, April, and May, practically none of those kids became professional athletes. And they went and they actually did studies on this town, and they looked at how coaches interacted with players. And what they found is that kids born in September were a little bit taller. They were a little bit more coordinated. And I'm talking at the time, these were like first graders in this town. And so they were a little bit taller, a little bit more coordinated, um, uh, and they were a little bit quicker. And so what they found is that the coaches in this province would pay attention to these young players that were a little bit bigger, a little bit more mature, and coach them to be better players. And what they found is that the coaches unintentionally did not spend as much time with kids who were a little bit smaller, kids that weren't as developed. And I think this has a direct correlation to the type of work and the type of intervention that we give to kids that we work with. Is if you look at adverse childhood experiences and you look at ACE scores, think about every ACE score, that every time a kid has a higher score, they tend to be a little bit more impulsive. They tend to make a little bit poorer decisions. They tend to kind of fall by the wayside. Meanwhile, we have other kids that are sitting down, that are paying attention, that are raising their hand in class because they got a good night's sleep that night. As teachers, as professionals, it's a lot easier to pay attention to those kids that are already doing a good job. It's a lot harder to go out of our way and coach up the other players, the other students, the other kids in our environments. And so I challenge you to think about, as you interact with young people, how can we encourage the kids who are struggling? How can we coach them up so we don't find these natural discrepancies that small interactions on a daily basis have for our kids? And at some point along the way, as kids, we all had dreams. We all envisioned a brighter future where we could do anything, whether it be becoming a doctor, being a musician, being an actress. But at some point, we started to turn off those dreams and we went into whatever direction that our life took us. And as kids with higher ACEs, they shut their doors on themselves much faster than other youth. And it's our job as adults and as a system to keep those lights on, to keep those dreams alive, and to help youth excel into a career, into a profession, into a lifestyle that can be beneficial to them and to our society. And so this will come to no surprise, but again, kids will do terrible things, but they're less culpable than adults. And the Supreme Court has looked at brain science and brain development and really said teenagers are still growing. They are not yet fixed. Their frontal lobes continue to develop. And so when they make poor choices, it doesn't mean that they're going to grow up to be scary adults. It means that they made a poor choice in their adolescent period, and that we shouldn't give them things like life without parole. And so there's some latest politics on the Supreme Court rolling back some of these decisions. But again, brain science is hard to argue with. And knowing that as mental health professionals, we can come in and we can help people learn the brain science and learn to propel kids in their development. And so there's this, not a chemical, but like a brain makeup called myelination that goes over, again, kind of your nerves. And it's all about practice. And so when you think about how we respond to kids who get in trouble, is we tend to remove them from situations. And it's that natural instinct of, well, it's easier to remove kids. What kids really need is an area where they can go and practice social skills, practice modeling, practice getting along with others. Because unfortunately, trauma and adverse childhood experiences has enormous impacts on brain functioning and development. And so again, the deprived brain on the right side of your screen is just huge when it comes to your thinking part of your brain. And so I throw this up there because we have to bring caution on how we respond to young people. Young people who get in trouble oftentimes don't look remorseful, oftentimes don't act remorseful. And it's because they're oftentimes afraid about what the system is going to do to them. And so they lock up, they harden. And so as we continue this conversation, I'm going to talk about how do we get kids to move past this? How do we get kids to be vulnerable for growth? But at the same time, how do we as a system not punish kids because they're just doing what is natural for them when it comes to their kind of physiological makeup? And so if we weren't doing this virtually, I would have showed a video of a 11-month-old who was learning to walk. And what you would see is that the little kid would kind of let go of his kind of safety net, and he would move really slow. And all you could see in the background is his parents smiling, encouraging him, and really just, again, kind of rooting for his success. And so when kids fall down, when they're learning to walk, we pick them right back up and we say, you can do it. But when teenagers mess up, we don't always choose that path. We tend to scold them. We tend to think about punishment. We tend to start labeling them as being bad. And so how do we figure out, how do we as a system, how do we as fellow humans support young people in this really tough adolescent period? And so, again, with Ross Green and some of the other excellent speakers that are coming, they're going to talk a lot about kind of the brain science around how do we get kids to use that frontal cortex, that thinking part of their brain where they develop empathy and moral reasoning. And then all of a sudden, we also have this very important part of our brain called the limbic brain. This is where kind of the fight, fright, or freeze response comes from. And kids, this is like the am I safe zone. And so when we talk about kids that have adverse childhood experiences, talk about kids that have experienced a number of traumas, their limbic brain is so hardwired to respond in ways that don't allow them to use their frontal lobe. And so in treatment, we need to figure out how do we help kids regulate this limbic emotion center. And then how do we coach skill sets to regulate first and then respond using skills in our prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for it. And so, again, as teens grow, we want them to be more independent, but their frontal cortex is still developing. And we know that teens will make poor decisions. And unfortunately, they aren't thinking about the consequences. And many won't understand or show empathy or remorse at the beginning. And so, many times as society, we say, well, let's just make the consequences really bad, and then teens won't make poor decisions. Unfortunately, it doesn't work, because when teens make poor decisions, they're not thinking about the consequences, or if they do, it's kind of a fleeting moment, and then they engage in that. And so, again, it's our job as a system to help teens kind of tie the pieces together, have them slow down, think before they act, and really think about what does rehabilitation or rehabilitation look like in this population. Again, I threw this up there as why is it so important to be careful with those emotion centers? And again, we can talk about race and cultural sensitivity within our treatments. We have to get kids to trust us. We have to be on the same team. And so in order to do that, they have to be vulnerable and show that and open up the ability for that emotion center to start to be regulated. And so I like to read this mantra from one of our group homes, because I think it really highlights how they approach kids and why they have such great outcomes when working with them. And so the mantra at People Inc. is, if telling it, which is in Salisal, Oklahoma. Again, it's a great provider for OJA for one of our group homes. But they start with every kid entering their facility, and they read this to their staff. If telling a kid to act different made a difference, it would have already made a difference, and they wouldn't be here. If punishing a kid worked to change behavior, it would have already worked, and they wouldn't be here. If giving advice to a kid worked to change behavior, it would have already worked, and they wouldn't be here. As a result, our treatment approach strives to be different so that we don't demand, punish, or give advice. We encourage, challenge, teach, rehearse, laugh, and strive to accept each kid in a way that they have never experienced before. That is the way that we want our kids to be treated. And so regardless of your treatment modality, regardless of whether you're using dialectical behavior therapy, multisystemic therapy, functional family therapy, approaching kids in a way that doesn't set them off and engages them and their family in treatment is so critical to what we do. Again, we encourage, challenge, teach, rehearse, laugh, and strive to accept each kid in a way that they've never experienced before. Growing up, one of my first, I was 19, I spent a summer in Buffalo, New York with kids with ADHD. And there's a doctor named Bill Pelham that runs this program called the Summer Treatment Program. And he would give a presentation. He would talk about how many times kids hear the words no, don't, stop, don't throughout their life. And kids with ADHD who are impulsive and hyperactive and inattentive hear no, don't, stop, quit millions of times before they enter the first grade. It may not be millions, but they hear it a ton of times. And so if you actually add that up, he talked about graduation rates in high school. And again, the more times kids hear negative things, the more they internalize that and the worse outcomes that they have. And so as treatment providers, again, kids are used to getting consequences. What kids are not used to doing is having conversations and skill building about how they can improve their behaviors and work together with those in their environments. And so there are a number of treatments that work. I've listed off 3 of them. And I really encourage you, regardless of what setting you're in, private or public, to look at these sites and to pick and think about our investments in our state and our investments in our families. And so, again, the Model Programs Guide is sponsored by the Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention. Blueprints is also ran through some federal funding in the Western U.S. And then the American Psychological Association hosts effectivechildtherapy.org. And so there are things like functional family therapy that can come into communities and reduce out-of-home placements by 1/3, reduce recidivism by 1/2. And so we have to say, how are we as a state pulling our funds, using our resources, and maximizing the skill sets of our providers? Because at the end of the day, it's you and me that are going to sit down in a room with these families, and we're only as good as our greatest tools. And so how can we maximize the tools that we have at our disposal? How can we maximize the tools that are available to families to help support them in their process and really just improve their outcomes across the board? And so each person's unique and likely has needs for different types of treatment. For instance, many kids that come into the Office of Juvenile Affairs come in with substance abuse, but their real problem is that they have untreated post-traumatic stress disorder. So maybe they need something like a trauma-focused CBT. And so as we get to know youth, as we have our assessments, treatment does matter, and a one-size-fits-all approach likely doesn't meet the needs of kids in our systems. Again, many kids that enter juvenile justice start with what we call kind of first-time offender program, which is a horrible name to give to a program where you're trying to uplift kids and not label them. And so calling them a first-time offender likely doesn't help that. But it's a one-size-fits-all approach. It's a universal prevention measure for further involvement in juvenile justice. And so we need to do a better job about individualizing responses based on the kids and the family's individual needs. And so each person has a unique pathway. And so this could be like dose and response. And so things like functional family therapy have shown that in a matter of 4 months or 16 weeks, you can have better outcomes than having a kid in individual therapy for over a year. Again, therapeutic connection is based on these relationships. It's based on how we start and how we tell families that I see you, I hear you, I care about you, is a place that we always need to start regardless of our treatment modality. Again, we'll talk more about this, but again, stress response and tailoring, understanding the kid's trauma background and how that fits into our interventions is important. Really getting our teachers, our workplaces to understand that mental health in these cases oftentimes looks like disruptive or disrespectful behavior, but it's really something that's happened to that kid that's kind of created a pattern of inappropriate behavior. But we can fix that if we start with understanding how do we regulate behavior, how do we get kids to relate with the providers, and then again, eventually getting to get kids to have better reasoning and being able to reflect on situations. Again, teen brains are hard to regulate. Emotions are tough to describe. And that's why it's so important for teens who get into trouble to work on these things to ensure their future success. Because the kids that I see on a daily basis have a tough time identifying accurate emotions for how they feel under basic situations. So layer stress or something that is kind of a larger factor on top of that and get them to be able to kind of regulate and identify their emotions. That's a skill set they need repeated practice. And so I talk a lot about the promise, and even for our toughest kids in our system, is that there's hope for them with the right kinds of environments. And unfortunately, or fortunately, punishment-based programming does not work. And so it's a natural instinct for when youth get into trouble to, again, sometimes throw the hammer down. And study after study has shown that that is not a wise decision if you want community safety and to reduce crime in the future. Punishment-based responses, whether it be things like military schools or boot camps or just removing kids from the community into detention, all of those things actually make it much more likely that kids will come back into the system, that communities will be unsafe, and that more violence will occur. If we want kids to be healthy and we want communities to be safe, we need things like restorative justice practices. We need skill building programs. We need counseling-based services. We need mentoring. And so, again, punishment is almost like giving a medicine that you know has negative side effects, like a poison, and it makes trauma significantly worse. Meanwhile, treatments that work with youth to understand how to engage in appropriate behavior lead to much better outcomes for kids across the board. And so again, adolescents are highly motivated by their peers. Most adolescents have family factors that impact their involvement. And so if you work with teens, this is my plea. Please work with family systems because working with family systems and getting parents and kids to communicate would solve so many issues. Again, it's not easy work. It's hard. It's easy for me to get up here and say that, but it's the hard work between the kids and the parents that can lead to better outcomes versus just working with the kid without the support system. Doesn't lead to as good of outcomes when you look at individual counseling when it comes to recidivism. But mentoring is a great thing. And again, we need a lot of it across Oklahoma for a variety of reasons. And so, again, without kind of going through kind of name brand therapies, the nuts and bolts of cognitive behavioral therapy, working on social skills, targeting academic programming, all of those things lead to improvements in kids' outcomes. And so I want to share some statistics because as I go across the state and I get introduced to providers, I find a lot of providers are very hesitant to work with kids that have juvenile justice involvement. And I think it's largely a misunderstanding that many of the kids I work with or that we work with in our system are scary or they're just inherently kind of have a different makeup. And so most adolescents who come to the attention of juvenile justice age out of crime. And so there's a reason that our system serves kids through the age of 19. And it's because after the age of 19 and really after the age of 21, most people stop engaging in criminal behavior. Again, there's going to be a subset, and I'll talk about that subset here in the future. But again, it's really important to know that adolescence is this turbulent period. Kids make a lot of poor decisions. Many of them may come into contact with juvenile justice, but that shouldn't label them and carry them throughout their adulthood. And so when you talk about juvenile justice, most people's heads go to these very small percentages of kids. thinking about kids that commit serious and violent offenses, whether it be murder or rape. And so thinking about these kids, only 8% of kids who engage in one serious or violent crime continue that pattern throughout adolescence, meaning that the vast majority of kids, 92% of kids that have engaged in a serious or violent offense, are on a better trajectory. And it was likely circumstantial or other factors that led into them making that very poor decision for their original charge. Looking at kind of the US as a whole and looking at multiple states and studies, what we find is that really anywhere between 1% and 3% of kids that get in contact with juvenile justice are these lifelong, serious, chronic, and violent offenders. And so at the end of the day, what I want to talk about is how do we not write off the kids once they enter our system? How do we ensure that they are the ones that, just like Malcolm Gladwell talked about, these athletes that were a little bit smaller, a little bit less focused? How do we make sure that the Jeremiahs of the world are the ones that we give the most attention to, the most support, because they're the ones who are most in need and where we can really have the biggest impact on our society in the future? Again, I'm excited to be with you today to talk about how do we design a system for today's youth and families where the vast majority of kids who come into contact with juvenile justice involvement are minority kids that come from poor families that have limited social supports. How do we see kids through that lens that allows us to have empathy for them in their situation, that allows us to see them as kids in need of support, in families in need of support, not as this is a kid and this is a family that has always been in the system. This is not a fixed thing, and there are tangible solutions that we can talk about. And many of them are on this slide where we talk about what is targeted prevention. What does that look like? I'm really excited we had an expansion program for our Botvan Life Skills where some of our youth service agencies were going into schools and working with elementary, middle school, high school, first-time parents, looking at preventing use of substances, looking at decreasing behavior problems, getting mental health providers in schools, having early home visiting programs for first-time parents, both for the dads and for the moms. I think in the last year or right before COVID hit, Oklahoma was seeing a boom in early reading programs where they were working with the prison systems and helping those parents read with their kids at night through kind of Zoom technology. So there's so many different prevention-based programs to target at-risk youth. But at the end of the day, we also need to have a continuum of care that's appropriate to match the level of need for kids. Again, this last year, DMH had some rule changes that hopefully will increase our capacity to have adolescents who need a residential substance abuse treatment program to exist in Oklahoma through the Sooner Care benefit. I know we're in the middle of transitioning to managed care, and so there's a lot of questions, but at the end of the day, this is where my head goes, is what does our continuum look like? How are we meeting the needs of children and families? Whether it be through functional family therapy or MST or looking at dialectical behavior therapy. This continuum of care is important because kids who are at low risk with low rate offenses should never, so even though they may engage in an illegal behavior, they should be diverted outside of the juvenile system so that we can save our resources, save our costs, and really focus on these youth that have more serious, violent, and chronic patterns to make sure that we're going to put them on a trajectory for success. And so in my presentations, I've been kind of layering this out there is people equate our treatment levels like psychiatric units. And so in juvenile justice, we have community-based placements, we have level E group homes, and then we have secure care. And in Hately, what these services do is they restrict the ability for kids to be normal. And so our most unnormal placement is our secure care placement, where kids are behind a fence. They have many locked doors, and really that they can't leave that facility. These are restrictions due to the safety concerns that we have for these kids, but they don't this level of care has nothing to do with the type of behavioral health or mental health care that kids are getting. And so I like to bring this up, talking about those outcomes where kids who stay in the community with the right treatments, with the right care, oftentimes can have higher levels of care than kids, especially in secure care where there's just so many restrictions. And so I like to throw that out there because some people believe that, well, this kid needs to go to secure care because they're really bad. And really, when we're making decisions around placement, we're really weighing kind of two factors. One is, what is the least restrictive that's going to be appropriate to the rehabilitation plan? And then what is the level of concern that we have for the youth to remain in the community, whether it be at a group home or at home with their family or with a kinship placement. And so I hope that made sense for those that aren't involved in juvenile justice. I know some of our systems, like detention and community intervention centers, can be confusing. And so this placement and cost and levels of care makes an enormous difference. So secure care costs a lot of money, but again, quantity or quality of care doesn't necessarily increase. What it does is make sure that kids stay safe in the facility. Things like foster homes, transitional programs, models like MST, day treatment programs, and traditional outpatient programs, the lower levels of care that we're able to work with our kids, the cheaper it is and the more money we save in the long run, as long as we keep kids out of these higher levels. Again, I am working kind of day in and day out, trying to look at what is this continuum of care? How do we support the providers in our communities? Not only do we give the providers the right tools, but it also saves communities money and it really makes them safer. And so I'm coming to an end. And at the end of the day, the question that I tend to go to sleep with every night is, how do we stop crime and improve safety? And I always come back to the same solution, as we do it through helping youth, through working with families, through partnering with communities. If we really want to solve adolescent delinquency and adolescent crime and improve the well-being of our future for Oklahoma, we will look hard and heavy at not only our juvenile justice practices, but our adult responses to criminal behavior. And we will build a system of support that really is built on mental health being a backbone of improving the lives of children and families. And so I can't say enough how thankful I am that we have wonderful providers across the state who are committed at delivering excellent and exceptional services to kids and families. And I thank you for your time and attention today. And I hope that you guys have a great rest of your conference. If I can ever be of support to you, my email address, my phone number are there, and we'll get connected. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'll see you guys soon.